volcanoes threaten nearly 500 million people across the planet. And that certainly includes people in France.
It's often said there are no active volcanoes in France. Of course, that's not true.
Active French volcanoes can be counted on the fingers of one hand. But on the other hand, they're some of the world's most alarming volcanoes. Reunion's Piton de la Fournaise can collapse and swallow the entire island.
Obviously, you mustn't be on the island at the time, because when it happens, the whole island will slide away.
Or its ominous neighbor in the Indian Ocean, the underwater volcano Fani Maouré off Mayotte.
There's a plume of gas that climbs 2,000 meters.
We're talking about 5 cubic kilometers, 5 billion cubic meters.
In the West Indies looms one of the world's deadliest volcanoes, Mount Pelée in Martinique.
With the infamous tragedy of 1902, one of the 5 deadliest eruptions of all time.
The other West Indies menace keeping volcanologists up at night is La Grande Soufrière in Guadeloupe.
Things happen underneath, and these things are continuous, so this type of eruption is bound to happen in the future.
In fact, more than 1 million people could suddenly see their orderly lives erupt into chaos from just one of these 4 volcanoes.
There it is, right in front of you, and it gives you the willies.
How do we calculate the real threat to the French population living in the shadow of hot-tempered, erratic volcanoes? How do we monitor these monsters? Now, top volcano specialists, along with computer-generated images and never-before-seen flyovers, will take us to the edge of one of nature's most provocative and terrifying spectacles. Piton de la Fournaise, Fani Maouré, Soufrière, Mount Pelée. 4 volcanoes that unsettle the French authorities, who must ask, will France be ready when the next one blows? In France, the image of a volcano is more like this. The Champ de Puy in Auvergne. Volcanoes that are peaceful, dormant, and therefore safe.
When you look at the volcanic massif of the Champ de Puy, it's 100 or so volcanoes aligned north-south over 35 kilometers. It's a very small area in which there are volcanoes that are said to be recent.
A grandiose, bucolic setting that seems frozen for eternity.
It's true that for us humans, looking at a beautifully rounded mountain covered with lush vegetation, with cows or sheep grazing, it's a bucolic landscape. And we think, well, nothing's happened here for a long time, so it'll never happen again.
In terms of recent volcanic activity, here's the scar left by the last eruption in the Champ de Puy. Lake Pavon, created some 6,700 years ago.
Lake Pavon was a very violent eruption. It's what was known as a phreatomagmatic eruption, meaning an encounter between magma rising at high temperature and water, which could be from a water table or a river.
Obviously, it's an explosive mix, especially when you know that 1 cubic meter of liquid water produces 1,000 cubic meters of water vapor.
That's what happened here around 6,000 years ago. An extremely powerful explosion, forming a circular crater and projecting volcanic material in the form of a plume to a very high altitude.
Volcanic eruptions that could one day occur again, right in the center of France, and threaten the 300,000 inhabitants of the Clermont-Ferrand conurbation.
The Champ de Puy represents around 100,000 years of volcanism. And during these 100,000 years, there have been periods of inactivity lasting several thousand years. So, maybe we're in a similar period of inactivity, with the potential for renewed activity in the years and centuries to come.
It's as if we just had a good night's sleep, yet we don't wake up the next day.
With one question still unanswered, when will this awakening take place?
We now know there's magma available at depth.
When I'm in the Massif Central, I think we're in a potentially active zone. There could very well be an awakening of the Auvergne volcanoes.
We are not safe either from magma returning directly from the mantle to the surface, or from magma arriving from deep that would heat the still extant magma reservoirs. The question is not if there will be an eruption in Auvergne, but rather when.
But French territory isn't limited to the French mainland. And some French volcanoes are even on the blacklist of the most active volcanoes on the planet.
In France, volcanoes haven't given any sign of life for a few thousand years. But if you go to the French overseas territories, things change completely. Volcanism is active. And that goes beyond the sense of having had an eruption in the last 10,000 years. Here, we're talking activity and eruption.
What's more, we have volcanoes that are active in different contexts, and therefore have completely different styles of volcanic eruption. Overseas volcanoes are volcanism with all the superlatives, really.
France's overseas islands are currently the focus of volcanologists' attention, particularly in the French West Indies, where the worst disaster of all could one day strike. It's a dream setting, the Caribbean Sea, just across the Atlantic. An extraordinary French bay overlooked by a gigantic, majestic volcano. Martinique's Mount Pelée dominates the Bay of Saint-Pierre, offering a picture postcard of paradise.
Martinique is one of the French territories that's just sumptuous, an absolutely verdant place. There's lush vegetation, palm trees, a tropical forest, incredible flowers.
Majestic nature. Yet behind this picture postcard lurks a veritable monster. A volcano capable of producing the worst eruptive scenario the planet has ever known. Mount Pelée in Martinique is now considered one of the world's most dangerous volcanoes.
Mount Pelée is one of the 5 deadliest eruptions. Over the last 2 centuries, volcanoes have claimed around 250,000 lives, and 200,000 of those were due to just 5 volcanoes. Tambora in 1815, 92,000 deaths. Krakatoa in 1883, 40,000 deaths. Mount Pelée in 3rd place in 1902 with 28,000 deaths. You have to remember what a volcano like Mount Pelée can do.
Mount Pelée went down in history on May 8, 1902 for an extremely violent and devastating eruption, one of the worst ever experienced by humanity. It totally wiped out the town of Saint-Pierre, one of the most prosperous at the time.
Late 19th century, Saint-Pierre was dubbed the Paris of the Caribbean because it was the place where the upper middle classes of the West Indies congregated. All chic boutiques, theaters, cinemas, which were just starting up. In short, a little corner of paradise.
But Mount Pelée still casts a shadow. and the volcano had been brewing for several years without anyone really paying attention.
The 1902 eruption had a number of precursors, actually since 1889. So if you can imagine, once again, you've got earthquakes on the island, maybe a smell of sulfur, fumaroles appearing, but you have to wait 13 years until 1902 for the eruption to occur.
At first, there were a few violent eruptions with nuées ardentes that killed quite a few people. There were over 1,500 deaths well before the eruption on May 8, 1902. But it was election time. Democracy had to take precedence over everything else. So the authorities asked us not to evacuate the town so that the elections could take place. And to reassure the population, the governor of Martinique came to settle in Saint-Pierre. Look, I'm here, there's no danger. He shared the fate of everyone else.
What happened on May 8th happened in seconds, sometime around 8 o'clock in the morning. A mass of magma was deposited at the top of the volcano, and this magma was undoubtedly very viscous.
And suddenly it explodes, and it explodes sideways.
It formed a volcanic blast, which projected huge quantities of blocks of magma, ash, and gas at very high speed.
Straight down to the sea and the seaside town.
The blast from the eruption destroyed the houses.
The city walls were all down, but all down on the same side. That is, those that were perpendicular to the passage of the fiery cloud all fell like a house of cards. The speed was such that the shockwave probably killed a large number of people before the cloud even reached them. In a few instants, the town of Saint-Pierre was wiped from the map, and its 28,000 inhabitants died instantaneously, never seen before.
This ultra-violent cataclysm, which falls on the city of Saint-Pierre, is called a pyroclastic flow. It is the most powerful and dangerous phenomenon that a terrestrial volcano can produce. A bit like the one that swept down the slopes of Mount Unzen in Japan in 1991.
If I put myself in the shoes of a resident of the town of Saint-Pierre on May 8, 1902, I can see a kind of wave arriving. A grayish breaker with protuberances and lobes, hurtling down the slopes of the volcano at great speed. In fact, it's an extremely dense mixture because it's made of rock, and extremely hot because it's made of gas directly from the magma.
The pyroclastic flow that devastated Saint-Pierre and killed all of its inhabitants on May 8, 1902, developed an extraordinary force. It swept down the slopes of the volcano, reaching Saint-Pierre in less than a minute at a speed of 500 kilometers per hour. A shock wave even preceded the flow. Estimated speed, 700 kilometers per hour. As for the temperature, in just seconds, it topped 400 degrees Celsius in the streets of Saint-Pierre.
Metal structures are twisted, which indicates the temperatures at the time, and the terrible photos of these people in the street, lying down, their bodies really deformed. You suddenly crank up the temperature to several hundred degrees, and our body, which is made of water, bursts, ejecting the viscera. Those are terrible images. It was a real trauma in Saint-Pierre. The town never got over it. Today, there are 10 times fewer inhabitants than in 1902. People are still worried because they have not forgotten. Those who live there today have grandparents, grandfathers or great-grandfathers, and mothers who lost their lives in the eruption, the famous eruption of Mount Pelée.
Could an eruption of Mount Pelée, like the one that ravaged Saint-Pierre at the beginning of the last century, happen again one day? And above all, when? Today, Mount Pelée is one of the most monitored volcanoes in the world.
What happened once will happen again. That's obvious. But when it comes to timescales, we don't know.
1902 is a little over 120 years ago. So from a geological point of view, it's also the blink of an eye. And when we see the activity on the island arc between Montserrat, Saint Vincent, and the Grenadines, we do think that something could happen. Mount Pelée is a very active volcano with 2 eruptions in the 20th century. So obviously, Mount Pelée is still a worry, and we know that violent eruptions will lead to population evacuations.
This killer volcano probably hasn't said its last word. History has already shown that major disasters are capable of striking these French territories, causing panic among the population. It's hard to imagine what's going on at the top of Guadeloupe's Grand Soufrière. Most of the time, the largest volcano in the Lesser Antilles has its head in the clouds. And only specialists have right of access.
Here we enter the restricted access zone. This is the beginning.
The entire summit dome is protected by a security perimeter, because here, danger is everywhere.
This is the phenomenon that we find everywhere on the summit of Soufrière. It's rainwater that infiltrates to great depths, whose temperature soars very high, well above 100 degrees. And this is the phenomenon we see here. Overheated water, which has perhaps risen to more than 300 degrees at high pressure, and which rises suddenly, releases this very large quantity of steam. Moreover, the sulfur that you see, the yellow color is indeed sulfur, comes from the magma located a few kilometers below the surface.
Welcome to the Forbidden Zone. To enter, you must protect yourself from toxic and corrosive gases, because for several years now, Soufrière has been a boiling volcano.
There's the name, Soufrière, because it smells of sulfur, because sulfur is native. So there's already an atmosphere of volcanism around the name. And finally, when you see the shape of this volcano from afar, the fumaroles at the summit already suggest what may have happened in the past and what may happen in the future.
This volcano is a veritable sword of Damocles hanging above the heads of the Guadeloupean population.
Activity has been increasing in recent years. We see that things are happening in the depths. We've detected swarms of earthquakes. We have increasing fumarole activity, an increase in the temperature of the fumaroles, and a change in their chemistry as well. So Soufrière is a closely monitored volcano. The statistical recurrence over the last few hundred years is one eruption every 50 years. Someone born today in Guadeloupe has a significant chance of experiencing a telluric event from a seismic point of view or from a volcanic point of view.
A worrying volcano, and for good reason. A good part of the population of Guadeloupe has settled on its slopes, enough to classify a large part of this highly populated territory in the red zone.
For Soufrière, 80,000 people are exposed within a 10-kilometer radius. So it's still a fairly populated area, and evacuating 80,000 people obviously requires plans. There are no 4-lane freeways in Guadeloupe to leave the south of Basse-Terre, which means it's impossible to evacuate the entire population in a few hours.
especially since the history of La Grande Soufrière proves it. This volcano is capable of the worst. The reason? It lies deep in the earth where a titanic geological impact occurred.
We're in what's known as a subduction zone, where the oceanic lithosphere of the Atlantic Ocean plunges into the mantle beneath the Central American plate.
The plunging oceanic plate will gradually release its water and restore it to the mantle above.
This water will change the properties of the mantle and allow it to partially melt.
The result? Waterlogged magma capable of generating the most violent eruptions volcanism on Earth can produce.
The violence of a volcanic eruption is determined by the quantity of gas emitted by the magma. And these gases are mainly water and CO2. So the more water in the magma, the more violent the explosions. This gas has to escape at some point. On Guadeloupe, we see the gases coming out, but part remains trapped deep down. If this gas remains trapped at depth in too large of a quantity, it can be emitted suddenly and therefore generate explosive phenomena.
When will Soufrière's next major eruption be? No one really knows. But the risk is real and the danger extreme. Enough to generate monstrous panic in the event of an imminent eruption. Like the black year that no one here has forgotten, August 15, 1976. The prefect ordered a general evacuation of almost 80,000 people. Guadeloupe entered one of the most serious crises in its history.
We're going to have up to 1,000 earthquakes a day. So that means when you're the local authorities faced with that in 1977, you say, what's going on? I've got to make decisions. Something's going to happen.
These earthquakes were between the surface and 6 kilometers deep. And above all, we saw seismicity rising towards the surface, which probably translated into the upwelling of materials, whether fluids or magma. So, if we see magma moving inside the volcano, there's a risk of eruption. But it's very hard to know if in fact this magma will make it to the surface or stop a few kilometers below the surface. And that's what makes predicting volcanic eruptions difficult.
Is the eruption imminent? And what on earth will it look like?
It was a bit of a panic because opinions differed. There was panic among the authorities, in part the prefecture, who really didn't know what to do, and among the population. The prefect, fearing a catastrophe, had 20,000 plastic caskets brought in and stored on the tarmac at the airport. This panicked the local population.
It was a rather rudimentary order to evacuate, lacking in judgment and organization, which did not set out any priorities, resources, or orders. It was a case of sauve qui peut.
In the end, the feared cataclysmic eruption with new magma flowing into the volcano did not take place. Soufrière calmed down, and the inhabitants finally returned home after several weeks.
Evacuation was essential because the risk was very poorly known, very poorly appreciated, and we couldn't take the risk of gambling with the lives of 70,000 people.
It's always the same. If you evacuate the population and there's a very big eruption, you're a hero. If you evacuate the population and there's no eruption, you've ruined the region's economy.
The summer of '76 finally ended with a false alarm in Guadeloupe. But could the countdown to a devastating eruption of Soufrière have already begun by then? The answer lies just 80 kilometers north of the Guadeloupe coast, on the British island of Montserrat.
It's a very similar volcano. We can see traces of collapsed flanks. We can see traces of dome growths. The composition of the magmas is not very, very different. So we have a good comparison of what could be happening in Guadeloupe.
This volcano is the twin of La Grande Soufrière in Guadeloupe. Even the name is the same, with a Montserrat version known as Soufrière Hills, a volcano that erupted continuously for almost 20 years.
And still today, in 2023, part of the island is an absolute exclusion zone where nobody is allowed to set foot.
Activity has ceased, but this part of the island is still inaccessible and uninhabitable, and it's been close to 30 years now.
When a quarter of the island is destroyed, what's left? Especially since it continues after a few years. From time to time, you have an eruption that gives you no warning, virtually no warning signs, and then it starts all over again.
Right now is when
Montserrat is an island devastated by 3 decades of unprecedented eruptions which ravaged the port, the airport, and above all, the capital, Plymouth, which has since become a ghost town.
Plymouth is less than 5 kilometers from the crater, so it was of course the active zone. And due to its proximity, it was logically wiped off the map.
The explosions became so violent that the pyroclastic flows covered the town, and Plymouth, often called a modern-day Pompeii, was completely ravaged. Not one inhabitant remained. They had all left, but all the houses were destroyed or buried under several meters of pumice, ash, and rocky debris.
Since the disaster, the fate of the people of Montserrat has been thrown into chaos.
All the administrative buildings were destroyed, so all the administration had to be moved. All the traffic reorganized, as communication routes were cut off. So a good chunk of the island's inhabitants evacuated and haven't returned since. Several thousand left for good, because there was no more economic activity.
Not to mention that, as throughout the West Indies, there was once a lot of tourists, but the tourists stopped coming.
Can Montserrat still rise from the ashes and recover from the disaster that has dragged on for 3 decades? Most specialists doubt it. Such an eruption in such a small area is likely to affect the island for a long time to come.
Who'd want to come back and live in a place like this, i.e., an island paradise that turned into hell on earth? Most people have no choice but to leave this place, which for them represents their worst nightmare. For them, it's a kind of survival, and to survive and forget means to move on elsewhere. There's no other choice.
Could Guadeloupe one day experience a catastrophe similar to that of Montserrat? At any rate, the similarities and proximity between the 2 islands have all the experts worried. La Grande Soufrière remains one of the most worrying volcanoes in the French overseas territories, and there are others. One of them even ranks 2nd on the list of the world's most active volcanoes. No one in living memory has seen anything like it. Monday, April 2, 2007, 10 a.m. Piton de la Fournaise on Reunion Island erupts. What specialists would call the eruption of the century has just begun.
An average eruption at Piton de la Fournaise is 10 million cubic meters, whereas this one is over 200 million. So we're talking about 20 times more in terms of volume, and above all, very rapid eruptive activity with extremely strong flows from the start.
So these are very high temperature flows, 1,200 degrees, and they're very fast, over 60 kilometers per hour, which is no joke.
A gigantic fissure almost 1 kilometer long opens up at an altitude of 600 meters on the side of the volcano. Real geysers of lava gush out, some as high as a 13-story building.
When flow rates are extremely high and emptying is instantaneous, we still have a large gas fraction. And this gas fraction will enable lava fountains to be set up. This is the first term of an explosive eruption, with fountains that can be several hundred meters high.
They're jets of lava 200 meters high, which will feed absolutely huge flows. And we're not talking small flows, they're rivers of lava. In the end, a whole flank of the island is glowing, and it's very impressive indeed.
At this stage, the first flows are advancing like a steamroller. By 3:30 p.m., they have covered almost 5 kilometers of Route National 2 and reached the ocean 4 kilometers away in less than 12 hours. Despite its violence, the eruption of the century caused no casualties, but it left indelible marks on Réunion's landscape, notably on Fournai's main crater, the Dolomieu, which could not withstand the cataclysm. Here's what it looked like before this historic eruption.
The Dolomieu was full, chock full of lava, because over the last 30 years, flows had been accumulating at the bottom of the crater, raising the level. And just before 2007, the flows were overflowing the crater.
And this is what happened after the violent eruption in 2007.
Over 500 meters long, 500 meters wide, the crater collapsed through 350 meters. That was a surprise, because we'd never seen collapses that big.
We're talking about a collapse of almost 400 meters. Let's face it, you could fit the Eiffel Tower inside.
In the hours and days before, we had a lot of seismicity in the rock column between the reservoir and the surface. We were having 2,000 earthquakes a day, and we thought, there's something not quite right here. We were expecting to see something like a collapse, but not on the scale. I'm not sure we envisioned a collapse 1 kilometer wide and 300 meters deep.
How could this gigantic crater suddenly collapse like a house of cards in a fraction of a second? Here again, the violence of the 2007 eruption is responsible for such a cataclysm. The magma reservoir that fuels this extraordinary eruption lies just beneath the Dolomieu crater, around 2.5 kilometers below the surface. But the emptying of this reservoir will not take place vertically in the crater, as is usually the case. This time, the lava will take a lateral conduit known as a dike and progress to the outlet fissure on the volcano's eastern flank.
This fissure, which is particularly low in the topography, allows rapid emptying of the magma chamber beneath the Dolomieu. And this rapid emptying left a void beneath the Dolomieu, which eventually collapsed under its own weight.
What's impressive is, you have to imagine it was filled to the brim. In fact, to the brim of the Bory crater just above. Generally speaking, we consider that the volume created by the collapse roughly matches the volume in the magmatic chamber. It's not exact, but it's an order of magnitude. So it gives you an idea of the reservoir beneath Piton de la Fournaise.
The collapse of the Dolomieu in 2007 resembles that of the Kilauea volcano in Hawaii in 2011. All in all, the eruption of the century of Piton de la Fournaise on Reunion Island lasted less than a month and produced as much lava as Piton de la Fournaise usually spews in a decade. At over 2,600 meters altitude, Reunion's volcano is a veritable monster, but also a fragile pyramid balanced on the ocean floor.
These volcanoes are very large and often very unstable edifices. They are built over periods of time ranging from hundreds of thousands of years to several million years, and are made up of a pile of heterogeneous volcanic products, which we know can collapse in on themselves.
It gets higher and higher, more and more massive. It grows and grows until it becomes destabilized, and at some point, it slides off and goes out to sea.
A titanic landslide in which an entire section of the volcano's flank plunges into the abyss. At Piton de la Fournaise, has the countdown to such a catastrophe already begun?
There's a real risk associated with flank collapses at Piton de la Fournaise, as we can see from measurements, deformation measurements, where we've had almost a meter of eastward displacement of Piton de la Fournaise in the space of just 10 years.
It wasn't until the 2007 eruption that we could record this with satellite images. During this eruption, we saw a 1.4 meter eastward displacement of the eastern flank, so much so that it really slid down the eastern flank. Since then, we've installed measuring equipment, seismometers, GPS, to monitor this flank's displacements, and we see that on average, we have a slow slide of 2 centimeters per year, which accelerates before and during eruptions.
To anticipate the catastrophic collapse of this volcano, you need to know exactly what's going on in its depths.
We're sending a current into the ground, which will pass perhaps 1,000 meters below our feet, and which will enable us to study the internal structure of the Dallamieu crater.
Hello?
Yes, Solène, it's Nico from the summit team.
I'm connecting to the summit. Are you ready for the injection?
Okay, so we can stand back and we're ready for the injection.
I'm injecting.
Injection.
This process is known as electrical resistivity tomography, a method of subsurface exploration that uses the ability of electricity to flow through a natural environment. The current flows much more easily in fractured areas of the subsoil than in massive resistant lava flows. The process enables scientists to pinpoint the volcano's most fragile zones, resulting in a precise map of the bowels of Piton de la Fournaise.
The idea is to get 3D imagery of the subsoil. So we'll go down to the depth of 1 kilometer and see what the structure's like beneath the volcano. Where are any potential destabilization structures, fractures, old feeder conduits, which can also be destabilization zones, the hydrothermal system, which can potentially generate phreatomagmatic eruptions, and what the magma may encounter when it rises to the surface.
Data that is vital to understanding and anticipating the major cataclysm that could one day occur.
If ever, for whatever reason, the volcano began to slide definitively, we could have a large number of cubic kilometers of material sliding out to sea and settling at a depth of 3,000 meters. That would generate a monstrous tsunami. You can imagine a tsunami that would ravage the coast of Madagascar, South Africa, even Australia on the other side.
A scientific study has even attempted to clarify this disaster scenario. If a 10 cubic kilometer landslide were to modify the eastern flank of Piton de la Fournaise, it would raise the sea surface by 150 meters at the moment of impact. The immense wave created could reach St. Denis, the capital of Reunion, and its 160,000 inhabitants in just 12 minutes. And neighboring Mauritius in less than 20 minutes.
Obviously, you mustn't be on the island at the time. You don't want to be there, because when that happens, the whole island goes down the drain. In other words, you can't think, I'm going to evacuate. The event is instantaneous. It starts in a few seconds, and then you just slide with it.
This gigantic landslide will happen one day. All those who specialize in this volcano know it. Especially since Reunion's volcano has already collapsed several times in its history, leaving indelible scars on this lunar landscape. Here's the latest. On Clou Fouquet, an immense depression 13 kilometers long and 9 kilometers wide, encircled by sheer walls. Veritable cliffs that can reach 400 meters in height.
This is the site of a collapse, a flanking gravitational collapse, which in fact forms a flow of material here towards the sea, and which has cut the rock along this collapse. So this Great Depression also gives us a glimpse of the possibility of a new flank collapse in the future.
Today, Piton de la Fournaise has become one of the most monitored volcanoes in the world. This French volcano is a worry, and it's not the only one in the region. Just 1,500 kilometers away, another volcano has been placed under close surveillance. Mayotte is the other French territory in the Indian Ocean. Here, volcanism is ancient history. Here are the remains of the last eruption. It was more than 7,000 years ago. Since then, nothing. Until the day in 2018 when Mayotte would experience an unprecedented event and witness the birth of the fourth French volcano.
On a global scale, new volcanoes forming remain rare. We often talk about existing, pre-existing volcanoes. We know their history, and at some point, they have one more eruption. Sometimes we have volcanoes that arise in the middle of nowhere, and that's exceptional. Where it becomes another story is when it happens right before our eyes.
May 10, 2018, a multitude of earthquakes hits the French island of Mayotte. Some register higher than 5 on the Richter scale. Unheard of.
We're not in a volcanically active zone. There's been no volcanic activity in Mayotte for several thousand years. So there's no active volcano, and suddenly we start recording a considerable number of earthquakes off the island's coast at great depth, and we don't really know what's going on.
Close to 1,800 tremors in just a few weeks. Panic grips the population.
There was no particular reason for large tectonic earthquakes. So in May 2018, when we see a 5.9 magnitude quake, we don't understand. And the aim was to find out the origin of this earthquake. Is it of tectonic origin or volcanic origin?
It was only after a while, when we began doing bathymetric surveys, we started trying to take a closer look. We realized that there was a major phenomenon happening, and these earthquakes, in fact, came from the fracturing of rocks on the ocean floor and the rise of magma.
All eyes are on the east of Mayotte, towards the sea. That's where the epicenter of all the earthquakes seems to be concentrated. The number of field expeditions increases, and scientists eventually find the explanation for this phenomenon. More than 3,000 meters below the surface of the Indian Ocean. An extraordinary discovery.
Yes, there's a volcano there.
It seems like a very broad system. There's no doubt about it.
We were far from imagining, before carrying out oceanographic campaigns, sending in submarines and sensors to see what's happening, that we would discover a new territory, or rather, a new volcano.
That's incredible. Did you see how high it went?
It's incredible. Look, that means it's being emptied of gas.
There's an awful lot of undersea volcanic activity on Earth. But what is exceptional is to see the birth of an underwater volcano of this type, and to see it grow so quickly and with such significant flow rates.
Its name, Thani Maorai. A gigantic undersea volcano burst from the depths barely 50 kilometers off the coast of Mayotte. In just 1 year, it grew to 800 meters above the ocean floor and extended over more than 12 kilometers.
You have to see that in 2018, there was almost nothing. And today you have a cone 800 meters high at a depth of 3,500 meters. In other words, that's 6 cubic kilometers of lava in the space of 3 years. And that is absolutely colossal. So we're at 400 cubic meters per second, so that's 3 times more than the famous 2007 eruption of Piton de la Fournaise. You have to realize that.
With such quantities of magma, the underwater eruption of Thani Maorai becomes the largest emission of lava on the planet in almost 3 centuries. The volume of lava emitted would be enough to cover the entire city of Paris with a layer of ash 20 meters deep. A colossal eruption, completely invisible from the surface, despite the existence of a gigantic underwater plume.
If I'd been told I'd see this once in my life.
Same here. What we represent here on this 3D digital model are echoes in the water column generated by the fluids escaping from the volcano. So there we have the largest plume coming out from the crater of the volcano, which is the highest point which appears in red here. And that corresponds to the bubbles or the hot fluids that can escape from the crater.
We are at 3,500 meters from that spot, and we have a gas plume that rises 2,000 meters. So that's something exceptional that hasn't been seen, hasn't been observed, at any rate.
The volumes of expelled magma are such that the island of Mayotte would even shift during this eruption, 25 centimeters eastwards in all. And more serious, it has sunk almost 20 centimeters into the ocean.
You simply have the emptying of the magma chamber, which is also located at great depth, which is quite atypical, between 20 and 30 kilometers deep under the island of Mayotte. And this emptying is done, also atypically, via a dike, a conduit about 50 kilometers to the surface, to the east of Mayotte.
The magma chamber could be compared to a balloon, which is filled, and Mayotte, which is placed on top. And as this balloon deflates, Mayotte will move and sink at the same time.
Could the island experience an unprecedented cataclysm following the emptying of this magma chamber? The scientific community is holding its breath.
What we fear is the collapse of the zone, because that would be accompanied by a movement of water, and therefore the formation of a tsunami.
Remember, too, that Mayotte's slopes are very steep, and with a series of earthquakes and stronger seismicity, there's also the fear of landslides on the slopes.
And the scientists still have surprises in store, because follow-up missions in the area won't just uncover one underwater volcano, but several hundred, which carpet a strip of the ocean floor over 600 kilometers long by 200 kilometers wide.
We don't really understand why this volcanism is focused here. There are lots of spots on Earth where we don't really know why there is volcanism. It means we're going to have to monitor this a little more closely.
Some imagine we may have something breaking through that was not known before. Others imagine that it is perhaps a new plate boundary being created. It's currently being studied, but what's clear is that it is an extremely important phenomenon.
And that's not all. On the seabed, just 10 kilometers from the coast of Mayotte, there are these rising gases which are worrying. Could a new eruption be imminent at the bottom of the abyss? And much closer to the island this time?
There are still earthquakes. There are still gas fumes and rising fluids, so it's important to continue monitoring this area to see what happens next.
This outgassing activity suggests that there's still magma deep in the process of degassing, and therefore the possibility of activity, either at the level of Fanny-Marais or elsewhere around Mayotte.
With Fanny-Marais, France has witnessed the birth of the 4th active volcano on its territory, proving that a new volcano can always be born anytime, anywhere. This puts France at the top of the list of countries most at risk of volcanic eruption. No French overseas territory is immune. Réunion, Mayotte, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. Each of these French islands is holding its breath in anticipation of the next eruption. For each of these territories placed under very close surveillance, the key question is, will we be able to anticipate the disaster sufficiently to evacuate the population and thus save as many lives as possible?